wanted to talk a bit about the big data revolution and what implications that has for the research community and social researchers in particular, and also about the kind of publishing responses to that one might have, and in particular what Sage is doing. But before going into that, I was keen just to reflect briefly on what the essence of publishing is in this day and age. And I turn to a wonderful prognosticator. Is this getting feedback? How about that? On matters technology and communication. This is Clay Shirky, you may recognize. And he predicted that publishing is going away. It's not a job anymore, it's a button. There's a button that says publish, and when you press it, it's done. So that was an interesting and provocative view of its time. It seems odd to me that Clay was able to locate his button when he himself published his book, Cognitive Surplus, via a publisher, unless he thought perhaps that little dot with the penguin inside it was the button he was supposed to be pressing. But I think it's quite telling that despite the fact that he, as a provocateur, as a denier of the value of publishing himself, chose to turn to a publisher to get his ideas across. That's not to say he was all wrong, insofar as he was talking about publishing going through a significant transformational moment. Of course, he's quite right. It's just that to read across from, let's say, the music industry or journalism fails to acknowledge some characteristics of publishing, which I think he didn't predict adequately, and his own behavior seems to contradict. Whether it's about him having a need for a publisher as a sort of reputation-conferring mechanism, whether it's about a particular set of skills and relationships, it's quite clear that the role of the publisher continues in quite a significant way, even in this modern day and age. It's just that it's not necessarily about a book or a journal. It's about a new set of ways. And I suppose that if you focus on the phrase, getting his ideas across, that ties into what we at Sage tend to refer to as our job, which is building bridges to knowledge. The idea being that if you take a concept or an idea from its origins through the research process, carrying it across into the minds of those seeking knowledge of understanding, that's the essential task. How do we do that well? Varies. It's a difficult piece of skill and engineering and requires a lot of effort and know-how to do it well. And you can do it in old-fashioned and particular ways depending on the task in hand, or more newfangled ones. But either way, we are bridge builders looking for ways to take ideas from their creation to their understanding. So that's, I feel, the essence of publishing, even if the mode in which we do it is massively transformed. And so to then our current world, saturated, suffused by big data. The phrase that people often like to use is that data is to the 21st century what oil was to the 20th century. The scale of it is extraordinary, and the unintended consequences that have followed from it are manifest. So we clearly are in an environment which is utterly different from even 10 years ago. This has huge implications for research, which I'll come to, but let's start with the implications it has for the public sphere. In fact, when you think about this question of building bridges to knowledge, never has that been more challenged. It's not surprising that the Oxford English Dictionary picked post-truth as its word of the year last year, because the actual signal is drowning in the noise for so many. And it seems almost quaint now to reflect back on the politician and social scientist, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who once said this: "You're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts." Well, if you are an avid follower of a certain Twitter feed, you would no doubt consider that to be really on a different planet from what we're kind of taking for granted today. And the consequence of that damage to the public sphere at all levels of information is that the bridges often look like this. So it feels like the bridge to knowledge is all the more urgent and necessary work to do, not just at the level of general public information, but in particular in relation to the research process. That we shouldn't see ourselves as a sort of in a post-expert society, as Michael Gove suggested, we shouldn't see ourselves in a post-truth society, and we should see the role of the publishing industry as helping repair those bridges and enabling that mechanism for getting them across. So the downsides of big data are there, and they're much debated and discussed. But there are huge upsides as well. It's extraordinary to think of how the big data revolution has transformed natural and physical sciences. You can't search for a Higgs boson, you can't look at the stars, and you can't sequence a human genome without being able to handle big data in enormous interdisciplinary teams. And yet, that extraordinary revolution hasn't quite hit the social research community in the same way. There's been a much slower uptake in social science for interesting, I think, quite valid reasons. So social scientists are concerned with ethical issues around privacy, around informed consent. You may recall there was an experiment done using Facebook data by Jeff Hancock and a few other psychologists out of Stanford who were playing with the Facebook newsfeed, changing the sentiment to see what impact on human behavior it brought about. Caused a big furore. Well, they were fine in terms of adhering to the standards set out in the terms and conditions of being a Facebook member. They were absolutely not fine when it came to the research committees, the ethics committees of the American Psychological Association. They came badly unstuck. And not only is it around ethics questions, it's also around just methodological ones. If you're trying to sell shoes, you probably don't really worry about who's fallen off the digital grid. But if you're trying to study inequality, that's a very different story. So there are good reasons why social science has struggled to take up the opportunity for the big data revolution. All that said, it's extraordinary, given that the nature of the data that's been created is so social scientific. If you think about the huge social media companies, if you think about the Twitter sphere, if you think about the fact that 650 million blogs are being written today, if you think about that there are 40,000 Google searches per second, it must be clear that there is a window onto the nature of society, onto the nature of human behavior, which is unprecedented, which is why quite often people say that the internet could be for social research what the microscope and indeed the telescope were for the natural and physical sciences. So there is a gigantic opportunity. Social science will be transfigured by this process. 10, 15 years from now, I think it will be very different. The question is for us as publishers, how to help usher that in and to enable new kinds of bridge building for social research knowledge claims. So I'm particularly fond of a quote from William Gibson, the cyberpunk novelist, who said once, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed." And I think that's a good clue for us in an industry of trying to anticipate the future, is to say, look around and see who's already doing now what other people will be doing in many years to come because of this unevenly distributed quality. And so that's what we have been doing at Sage. And I want to zoom in on a particular example of that. So here is a fairly typical news story that you might find where a journalist is covering a piece of social research. In this case, it's looking at how protests turn violent, where there's conflict between the police and the protesters. And it's on the face of it, fairly standard-looking article reflecting on a piece of research at the University of California. But what's extraordinary about this piece of research is how it was done. And that's the thing I want to give you as an example of the unevenly distributed future. So that research was done by Nick Adams. This is Professor Nick Adams, who is, I would say, a sociologist from the future. He is based at Berkeley, and I met him a couple of years ago, and he was telling me about his interest in social protests and violence and so on, and I was thinking, so far so good. And then he told me what he was actually up to. He had studied, for example, the Arab Spring. He looked at Tahrir Square. He had understood all the social science theory about protest. He said, I wanted to do something on a much larger scale, much more generalizable. So he took on the entirety of the Occupy movement in North America across dozens and dozens of cities, thousands of incidents of different kinds. And he took on the vast corpora of text covering those incidents whether it's police reports, media reports, and decided to analyze that. But what he said to me was, if I were to do it with traditional sociological methods, doing content analysis, it would probably take my team about 15 years. So instead of doing it that way, he came up with something new. He built a piece of software called Text Thresher, which sits at the end of a process that he developed. The process is what he calls a crowd content assembly line. It starts out with crowd workers and then civilian scientists to chunk down, so he chunks down these vast corpora of text, is able then to get the crowd workers to categorize who did what, when, etc., in bite-sized bits. The output then of the crowd workers' efforts become training sets, which then go into the machine learning algorithm which he's written, which is embodied in Text Thresher, and is therefore much more scalable. And so in terms of being able to do the analysis that supported that and many other journal articles that he's done, he effectively said he boiled down what would have been 15 years of work into about 12 months. And to me, that was quite revelatory. It was a fascinating insight, I think, into the kinds of things social scientists might be able to do in the future. And when you look at what Nick does and how he does it, the first thing you realize is that he may be a sociologist, but he doesn't live in a sociology department. He lives in an interdisciplinary lab at Berkeley. You can see the tagline, Intelligent Research Design for Data-Intensive Social Scientists. He works in a highly collaborative mode in an interdisciplinary lab working with computer scientists, computational linguists, other social scientists interested in similar topics. And is only able to do this kind of work because of massive collaboration of that kind of scale. So that for us is a window onto what social science might look like in the future, and incidentally tackles a long-standing question, which is what's good interdisciplinary research? It was Gary Brewer who pithily observed in 1999 that universities have departments while the world has problems. And in order to move to a more sort of challenge-led approach, multimodal mode, you need a much more interdisciplinary mode of working, but that's harder to do. But the interdisciplinary lab could start to tackle that. So in many ways, I think social research could be hugely improved, indeed revolutionized by this kind of model. But as William Gibson said, the future is unevenly distributed. It's happening here and there. It's happening in Berkeley, it's happening in the MIT Media Lab, it's happening at Stanford, it's happening at Harvard. But when you look across the world of social research, it's nowhere near happening yet. So back to now to how we have engaged with that challenge and opportunity. This you may be familiar with. It's a sort of one way of slicing sort of innovation core versus, it's quite a familiar model. I've put up a version of it that refracts it through the concept of relationships. So the kinds of relationships distinguishing between core, adjacent, and more transformational to look at different ways of engaging with the big data moment for social research. And so, obviously, within the core, we're doing a vast amount of work with our current relationships with our authors, with our editors, with our learner societies. We're engaging with them through the traditional modes of publishing. We're publishing textbooks and journals like crazy. We know this is a big movement. We're seeing how well these articles and these journals are doing, how much they're downloaded, how widely they're cited. We know that this is a coming thing, and working with our core relationships is obviously a central part of our activity. But it's not restricted to that. We want to look more radically, because of the nature of the problem that I've identified, to more adjacent relationships and indeed more transformational relationships. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those relationships, but before that, a word or two about innovation in general. So this is how we tell ourselves at Sage that innovation happens. It's very simple. You start with the thinking, and then you do your wireframes, and then you make the thing. To borrow the phrase from Farmer, from brain to basket. They say it takes 10 years, and I don't know how many millions. Vincent could say better than me. And obviously that's a very neat, simplistic image. That's some of our colleagues, indeed, working on one of our online data sets that we've created, and there it is suddenly produced. But we know that the reality is a little bit more like that. For all sorts of reasons. We know that the innovation process is a long and rocky and difficult one. And no doubt that's going to be the case for us as we build the tools and services we're going to build for data-intensive social science. There are two kinds of problems with innovation in particular that I thought I would just mention. The first challenge to innovation, I think, is nicely expressed by this cartoon, where you see these two professors talking, and you note that one of them, intending to deconstruct the argument made by the other, says, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2, which says, then a miracle occurs. And this, I think, you could call knowing too little. And we've tried to avoid that problem by doing significant amounts of research. We've done a very, very large-scale survey of social researchers around the world, and indeed have had nearly, I think it's 9,600 responses, where people have set out the degree to which they're engaging with big data and new technology, the degree that they want to, the extent to which they're hampered, and what kinds of reasons that they are hampered by, which come down to 4, which I will come to. And it's very much been a grounding and trying to get very close to what the actual problem is that we feel needs to be solved in the eyes of different social researchers. However, if you look that closely, you can drift into the other problem with innovation, which is nicely expressed by the featureitis curve. If you go along on the x-axis, as the number of features increase, you know that we have this problem with the user happiness starts to go up and then peaks and then quickly descends on the other side as you bolt on more and more neat solutions, solving more and more problems of different kinds, and requires a disciplined approach. And this problem could be called knowing too much. Now, if you know too much, you're in danger of building one of these. So we've got to somehow move between the Scylla and Charybdis of the sort of innovation space, and the decision space for innovation is obviously indefinitely large. So we need to be disciplined about it. So we've taken our cue from the Eric Ries Lean Startup book you may be familiar with, and in particular the Lean Value Tree framework, as a way to try and distill down the kind of approaches we might take, which very much focuses on be clear what your mission level goal is, identify the specific goals within that mission that will support it. I then identify the different kinds of bets you might place underneath that, and then you come through your initiatives. And it's quite a process, quite an intensive process, but very good, I think, at focusing the mind on the challenge. This is the way that our team have populated that for this particular problem domain. So we've got a mission, which is to improve social science by providing tools and skills to help people work with big data and new technology. And that mission level is then guided by the 4 goals that we identified as the main problems that the large-scale survey we did identified. There were other ones beyond that, and there's other ones I mentioned earlier, such as ethics and representativeness and methodological issues. But there were kind of 4 practical seeming problems that social researchers were saying really help stop them crossing that chasm into doing data-intensive social science. And they were skills, collaborations, tools and software, and data. The skills weren't just about them having quantitative skills, it was actually understanding how to do coding. The issues around collaboration and data kind of go together. With data, a lot of it was to do with the issue of how do you access data often held by private companies, or how do you mash together different data sets in a way that enables you to analyze them cleanly. And then the collaborations that come with that. It's very hard to get data scientists and social scientists to spend time together. You need to align up incentives. You have to find ways of getting those relationships to work. And then tools and software is a very specific thing. How do you get more things like Text Thresher from Nick Adams to actually help people solve this in a bespoke way? And there's lots I could say about that, but in the interest of sort of keeping it finite, I wanted just to mention something about how the kinds of relationships we're taking on, going back to that innovation graph, are driving some of the ways we're innovating in this space. As I say, of course, we're doing our book publishing and our journal publishing in this area. Here I'm talking about how we're going into the adjacent and more transformational spaces via those relationships. So taking skills first, we've ended up launching a group of online courses to help people tackle the kind of their lack of skills in this area. And indeed, we launched them about 2 months ago. Found significant take-up and that they're willing to pay for them, which was interesting because a lot of free educational material out there. We discovered that the completion rates are fairly low as yet, so they've only had a couple of months, but it's interesting. Some of us are wondering whether it almost is tantamount to gym membership. This, by the way, is the list of courses that we launched. So Introduction to Python for social scientists, interactive data visualization with R, etc. And it is striking to see how the appetite is there, but the follow-through, and we're using this as a process of learning, and we're going to relaunch these courses, and then another 4 on top, and do throughout the year a really major tackling of this skills gap issue, with everyone who's taken the course becoming then an advisor for us and a source of feedback, which we then use to revise and refine those courses. But you'll notice on the question of relationships, how every course has a partner, from the Royal Statistical Society, indeed to include Nick Adams' own D-Lab at Berkeley. And that's where I mentioned sort of adjacent relationships. We've long had relationships with people in academia of different kinds, but this is at the institutional level where we actually have these sponsors. And that's an important way of configuring our relationship to solving problems that fall outside of something which just is met by a core solution. Now, relationships and the adjacent mode are fairly easy to do, but when you're looking at relationships in the more transformational mode, we decided to look further afield. And here you can see a picture of Tim O'Reilly, who is well known probably to everyone in the room as the person who ran O'Reilly Media, credited with coming up with the term Web 2.0 and much else, sort of Silicon Valley guru, but whose superpower, if any, is about managing relationships between people who have common interests but don't normally spend time overlapping each other. So he's got a particular gift for this. He's been doing it through his conferences in so many ways, but perhaps most significantly in this way, which is Saifoo Camp, which is something he's been running for about 15 years with Nature, also digital science alongside that, and Google, who host it annually. And Saifoo has become sort of well known as a space to engender conversations which lead to rich collaborations. People who wouldn't necessarily meet each other in their common walk of life, but are able to, through the kind of good offices of being pulled together by Google, who've got the sort of pulling power to get people to fly in for it, do what O'Reilly calls adding synapses to the global brain. He likes to do it in the odd tones, the cool and extraordinary tones that you tend to hear in the Silicon Valley world. So, as is often the spirit of innovation and publishing, if you see a good idea, nick it. We've decided to launch the first social science Foo Camp. And this again, with O'Reilly Media and Tim in particular, where the host organization is not Google but Facebook, and where Nature was the provider on Saifoo Camp of the various scientists, we've been at Sage the source of the social science population who are attending Facebook, and it's an event happening early next year. 200 to 250 people from social science at different walks of life, different regions, data scientists, both in the academic world, like computer scientists and academia, and people working in data science. And the interesting thing about it is, I think we will start to achieve the collaborations that we have found quite hard to do in other ways when we've done our hackathons and other kinds of things, because they're converging on this shared sense of what does a data-intensive social science future look like, and also because it's helping build out on that sort of unevenly distributed future that I mentioned William Gibson identifying. So the fact that it's at Facebook in Menlo Park in Silicon Valley is very important. And one of the ways of seeing that is, a couple of weeks ago when some of us were out there on a planning meeting, we spent the morning at Stanford, we spent the afternoon at Facebook, and in the morning at Stanford learned how there's almost like a revolving door between the social searchers at for example, the Center for Computational Social Science at Stanford and the big tech firms. The tech firms are hiring in the researchers, and then they're going back out into academia. And it's a bit analogous to the Kennedy School at Harvard, where you get a lot of academics moving into the administration and out again. And you could see the beginnings, I think, of what's happening there. We talked to a particular sociologist called Paolo Parigi, who's the co-director of the Computational Social Science Lab. And he was currently professor at Stanford, had previously worked at Uber, and was just about to start his new job at Airbnb, where he focuses in particular on trust. And it's just very interesting to watch. I think what's happening is this merging of interests where the academics are realizing that in order to get close to the skill sets and the tools, and in particular the data, they need to engage with the tech companies. And meanwhile, at the same time, the tech companies are beginning to widen the scope of their engagement because they themselves have discovered the unintended consequences of a somewhat sort of mono-focus on one thing. If you've optimized your algorithms to increase engagement, well, who knew? It turns out you don't necessarily bring the world together like Mark Zuckerberg would like. In fact, you create filter bubbles and echo chambers and partisan politics. Now, had they engaged with social scientists earlier on who might want to look in a more holistic way about how communities form, how groups interact, to the extent to which norms govern online behavior versus offline behavior, they may have had the kinds of insights which they're now scrabbling to find, which is partly where their motivation is now coming from. So it's quite fascinating to see a convergence between the tech industry, who hire scientists to do essentially quite specific work, which is how do I sell more advertising, and now are engaged in much broader sets of questions. And indeed, no doubt that's partly for their PR concerns, because there's no shortage of criticism and hostility in the media about all sorts of issues, as you're all familiar with. So it's a gamble for us, but I think a very rich way of moving into that more transformational mode of collaboration. What it also tackles, along, because I mentioned the skills, the collaboration comes with the data question, because there is potentially now the route for us to get access to data that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to provide to the social scientists. On the whole, the big social media companies are wary of releasing their data sets out for social scientists to use them. They sort of invite them in to do it under sort of fairly controlled circumstances, but they're wary about it because they feel they're going to get beaten about the head for crossing lines on privacy, as indeed happened when the Jeff Hancock team did that work with Facebook many years ago. However, if they have the right kind of relationship, are able on a more controlled basis to do it. So the nice example right now going on, they're working with a well-known economist called Raj Chetty, probably one of the most clear front runners for Nobel Prize in the near future. And he's interested in upward social mobility, and he has a sort of working hypothesis that if kids growing up have a more varied, socioeconomically varied network of people, the likelihood of them being able to have more upward social mobility is higher. And he's being able to test that now by being given access to Facebook data, where he can look at cohorts of students in their year groups, typically who have friends to use the verb, other students in their same year group, but across those different years actually have a fairly varied sort of range of people in terms of socioeconomic up and down. He can then track those cohorts through time and test out if there's some causal support for his hypothesis that you can get better social upward mobility. But that's an example of a social scientist working with Facebook who have, under controlled circumstances, now given him access to that work, to that data. And I think what we're finding, and I think with the Facebook that people themselves were also saying, was while we don't want to do some blanket academic license for social scientists, because it's very hard to control where that data goes and how exposed we'll be if it then gets, if it's not adequately de-identified or whatever it may be, we also know that a lot of it comes out of trusted relationships. So it's actually quite ironic talking to this giant social media group about how actually people meeting in the flesh creates a form of relationship which you can't really parallel in any other way. And so the Social Science Food Camp, bringing together the social scientists and the data scientists at Facebook, as well as people at Google, as well as people at Twitter and LinkedIn, will, I think, help forge the quality of relationship that enables the kinds of collaborations and then potentially the access to data that tackle some of those fundamental questions that that we saw coming out of our questionnaire that we need to help engage with. And this, I think, is all in the mode of transformational relationship creation. The mode of the meeting is an unconference. So Vincent, you mentioned there's like one unpopulated slots in this conference. Well, in the Social Science Food Camp, all the slots are unpopulated until the first night. So 250 people turn up in the room, kind of say in 3 words who they are, and then go up to large boards and put up their post-it notes saying what they'd like to talk about and see who they can draw in. And that's the entire mode of it for the entire weekend. So I've talked a bit about skills, talked a bit about collaborations and data. I just want to say one more thing about tools and software, which is the other problem area we identified, and then I'll stop. So investments in tools. Our approach here is investment. We're looking to we're looking for not just the tools, but the tools at the right stage of evolution. There are kind of quite well-established tools which are, to some extent, designed for the corporate sector. There are lots of tools around that help you analyze the Twitter sphere, analyze social media data. There's even a quite significant innovation from Harvard, which came out of the Institute of Quantitative Social Sciences at Harvard under Gary King, called Crimson Hexagon, which is a pretty successful commercial arm coming out of Harvard, but it's quite clear that it's moved into servicing the corporate sector. It's helping people analyze social media data if you're trying to do various kinds of things to promote. What we're looking for is more early stage startups, and we're looking for them with a view to identifying social scientists who themselves are trying to solve a problem, and then to see whether we can pick that up and scale it. So that's the sort of the approach. So as I say, by social scientists for social science. So we've got these sort of different approaches to it, and the concept grants will be a sort of more bread upon the water. If you're out there solving these kinds of problems, if you're part of that unevenly distributed future, come to us. We'll give you some seed funding and look for a way to help develop and bring your product to market so that we can actually provide those tools which are more bespoke. And it doesn't just have to be those grants or even joint ventures or investments. Quite happy with collaboration agreements. And we currently have 3 active conversations with 3 different sort of software developers underway right now. We expect to release the beta for the first one of those in April or May next year. And what it does is analyzes the Twitter feed, but does it in a way that has been road tested by loads of social scientists who are busy using the current early version of it to actually publish social research outcomes. One of the tests we're using of whether it's working by social scientists for social scientists is to say, are they able to get grants from the ESRC? Are they able to, on the basis of this methodology, are they actually able to make a knowledge claim that might stand up in the academic literature? Because if you go back to Nick Adams, the sociologist, when he wants to publish material and decide he's adequately passed the kind of reputational threshold, he'll be publishing in the trad journals for all his new modes of creating knowledge claims. He'll be using preprint servers and blogging, but in the end, the test of his career is that he'll be publishing articles in American Sociological Review. So with each of these new methodologies, we're trying to establish that there is someone doing the work now, making knowledge claims on the back of it, which are being accepted by peer-reviewed journals as a sort of gold standard test of whether the technological innovations here actually support social science knowledge claims. Not just it helps you do some sentiment analysis on Twitter, or it might help you increase engagement slightly and capture a few more eyeballs. It really is there a hypothesis you're trying to test adequately, and does this tool enable you to do it in a way that gets you the approbation of the academic global community? So that's the approach we're taking on tools. So then just to kind of recap then. So that survey that pulled up those 4 areas said effectively there's an issue around skills, issue around collaboration and data, an issue around software tools. And then on those different fronts, we're trying to tackle them, but very much looking at relationships in a more radical way than we typically did. Rather than just building on the relationships we have with our author base and our editors and our contributors, though of course we do draw on them heavily, we're also going on from them to more adjacent relationships and indeed more transformational relationships. And that's taking a lot of doing. It's a completely fascinating process because I think we are glimpsing what a reconfigured social science will look like. Not to say all social science will be done that way, but I think a very substantial part of it will. And I think we're going to do our part to try and usher that in. It's going to be complicated work. It's more than just this guy jumping across a chasm to get back onto good quality bridge building. But if we're able to do it well and robustly, at a time when it's more important now than ever before, then it won't just be good for us as a company and good for academia. Our view is it'll be good for creating healthy minds and healthy cultures more generally. So that's me done. Thank you.